She slapped an eviction notice on my front door, said I had until noon to pack, or she'd make arrangements. I laughed at first. Because who in their right mind forges a sheriff's seal and thinks they can evict someone over a garden gnome? Right. Then she smiled, and the laugh got stuck. And everything that followed felt like waking up inside a movie that forgot to hand me the script. My name's Eli Gardner. I grew up in a town called Willow Ridge, a place with one stoplight, 2 diners, and more opinions than parking spaces. I own a modest house on Sycamore Lane, a blue bungalow with a sagging porch swing and a stubborn maple that I swear is older than the HOA president, Marla Kent. I say that with affection. I'll say a lot of things in this story with affection and anger both, because you can't tell it straight without both. This whole mess started over a little strip of dirt and a sign. But it wasn't really about dirt or signs, not at the start. It was about control. About who gets to tell a neighborhood what belongs to whom. And about what pride looks like when it turns sharp. We had lived on Sycamore Lane for 6 years. I fixed the roof after a storm, mowed my lawn on weekends, and learned the quiet calculus of suburban living. Keep to your side of the fence. Smile at the right time. Don't ask too many questions at the board meetings if you don't want answers. I believe the HOA was an annoyance, not a menace. I believe people were complicated but basic at heart until Marla decided to escalate the petty into the public. It began small. Of course. A letter typed, official looking, delivered without a name, claiming that my garden encroached on HOA property. I had, for 3 years, my tomatoes, a row of lavender, and a little wooden sign that read private garden. The sign was harmless. The tomatoes were thriving. But Marla had been walking that stretch more often, clipboard in hand, cheeks flushed as if the wind itself were her fan club. She always had a line ready about standards and beauty and community pride. For her, the rules were a kind of sermon. For me, they were a guideline. When I ignored the first letter, she showed up at my gate with 2 other board members like she was leading a small parade. She spoke in the tone people adopt when they believe they're doing you a favor by asserting authority. Eli, she said, smiling the smile of someone handing out bad news. We've had several complaints. You'll need to remove the sign and the plants that creep past your property line. I pointed at my deed, the one that lists my property lines in black and white, and said, this is where my property ends. She peered at it the way you peek at a menu written in a foreign language, and then said, we'll send the surveyor. That was the first time the word "we" began to feel like an army. 3 days later, a thin piece of paper appeared on my door like a moth. It had a seal I'd only ever seen on TV, a county sheriff's stamp. Slightly askew. The ink too dark to be honest. The letter notified me of a notice of removal and gave me until noon the next Tuesday. The neighbors watched from their driveways as Marla taped it on, concentrating like she was decorating for a holiday she'd invented. Some cheered. Some shook their heads. My hands went cold. I called the sheriff. The officer at the desk laughed at first, then told me that the seal was a fake and the signature belonged to someone in marketing for a local bakery. It was ridiculous comical. You'd think if it weren't happening in the raw world we wake up in. We went to the station to file a report. They took my statement, took photos, took notes, and promised an investigation. That should have ended it. But when a person decides to escalate, the world rearranges itself to accommodate that escalation. Marla doubled down. She created what she called a community adjudication panel, printed out letters with a pixelated court header, and staged a hearing in the community center. She invited people by email and by hand, and she rang the meeting like a bell. The local news picked it up, silly human interest. HOA drama, but the cameras made everything heavier. The lights pushed shadows where we hadn't expected them. I sat in the back with a thermos of coffee cooling in my lap and watched as a woman I'd once waved to with a nod turned the business of my life into theater. The hearing was performative. Marla read allegations with the cadence of someone reading a menu, embellishing each line with dramatic pauses. Encroachment, she announced. Violation of aesthetic guidelines. The board members nodded as if they'd rehearsed the choreography. A couple of neighbors testified, one with genuine concern, another with an old grievance about a noisy dog from a year ago. I spoke at the end. I read the deed. I kept my voice steady. I told them about the tomatoes that fed my neighbor Rose's kids in summer, about the maple shade where Vince, My best friend had proposed to his wife 2 years ago. I expected reason. I expected that the deed would weigh more than the theatrics. Marla smiled, as if she'd been waiting to be contradicted. The escalation turned physical one hot July afternoon. Someone I never did learn who, though I have a few ideas now, slashed the tires on my truck. A message was left on the windshield in permanent marker: "We clean our own." It was a message and a threat, the two in one breath. I slept with the neighbor's porch light on after that. And in the morning, I found a fresh set of lawn signs planted in my yard. Community standards in bold. An arrow pointed directly at my door. Later that day, Marla posted a video on the HOA's social page, walking the lane with a phone in her hand, narrating like a nature documentary. She called it restoring order. The comments split like a river, some praising, some furious, some amused. I watched the woman who'd once loaned me sugar now stand on footage like a magistrate of taste. There's a peculiar psychology to people who pursue control. It's not always malice. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's fear dressed as principle. Marla told herself and told anyone who would listen that she was protecting property values, that her actions were about maintaining a standard. But beneath the standards, there were petty scores, a council of grievances, and the curious pleasure people take in enforcing a rule when they believe the world owes them compliance. I started to see patterns. Marla had fallen out with neighbors before. She'd run for the board after a dispute over a mailbox. And she'd been rumored to covet a patch of community land that sat behind 3 properties, one of which touched my lot. The motives crystallized not as a single villainy, but as a braided thing: envy, ambition, and an old hurt that had never healed. I did what any reasonable person would do. I documented everything. Bodycam from my phone when she came to the gate. Timestamped photos. Witness statements from neighbors who, privately, agreed that this had gone too far. I posted a short clip online, nothing incendiary. Just the taped petition and Marla delivering her lines with that countenance of someone certain of being right. People share things, and things take on lives of their own. In a town like ours, the video moved like gossip at a barbecue. It drew attention not just from neighbors, but from a journalist at the county paper who smelled the story and had a nose for the dramatic. And then things turned sideways in a way I didn't see coming. Someone edited the video and uploaded a version that made Marla look angrier than she was. A version that trimmed pauses into scowls and stitched in an ominous soundtrack. It went semi-viral. In less than a day, the HOA's Facebook page had 1,000 comments. Half mocking, half outraged, all shouting into the same thin stadium of screens. Volunteers from the county called to ask about the forged document. The sheriff's office finally came by with a lieutenant who took the investigation seriously now that it had legs. The narrative began to shift from whether Eli was a threat to whether Marla had crossed a line. Humiliation is a useful thing in public life. It strips away veneer. Marla felt it like frost. She began to act unpredictably: press releases and then denials, stern letters and then awkward apologies. Entitlement doesn't like losing its reflected glory. She doubled down on formality, convening meetings with subpoenas and the kind of legal-sounding language people throw around when they want a paper to look like a sword. The community, meanwhile, splintered. Some stood by her old friends, board loyalists, people who liked the way she organized the bake sales. Others recoiled. A rally formed at the town square the weekend after the edited video spread. People carried signs that read, "Due process, not drama," and "Stop the witch trials." I found myself in the middle of 2 certainties: that I had a right to my property and that a woman who had chewed up other neighbors' lives for sport might finally be held to account. The real turning point came when a bodycam, not mine, but someone's, a security guard hired by the board, it turned out, surfaced and showed Marla in a different light. The footage wasn't edited. It captured a late-night meeting in which she and 2 others discussed ways to shore up her position. The camera showed her folding papers, stamping faux seals, and laughing about the idea that they could scare people into compliance. Watching it felt like seeing the backstage of a theater, all wires and hand signals. The cheapness of the props exposed. The sheriff's office moved swiftly after that. A warrant was issued to collect evidence. Documents were seized. Marla's computer was taken in a brown paper bag that smelled like denial. That's when the legal machine started to grind. Forgery charges, harassment complaints. The board was forced to call an emergency meeting and, under pressure, commissioned an independent audit. News trucks with satellite dishes lined the main street like exclamation marks. The town, which had never wanted to be important, was suddenly important for the worst reasons. For me, the relief was mixed with an odd sense of pity. Pity. Because the woman who had once called herself a protector of community had become the community's cautionary tale. Everything culminated in a courtroom not built for television drama, but for considered decisions, a county building with echoes, and a real judge who wore his work like a well-worn coat. I sat in the gallery with Rosa and Vince and a handful of neighbors who had taken time off work to see this through. Marla walked in with a group of supporters. Her jacket buttoned. Her jaw set. There was a moment when our eyes crossed, and I saw, plain as a mirror, the person I'd known in small-town moments, the neighbor with borrowed sugar, but she was a smaller version. Defiant and cornered. Too proud to show the cracks. We played the Bodycam footage in court. We laid out the forged notices, the printed court letters, the planted signs, the threaded threats. Evidence has a way of telling a story that words cannot. The judge watched with a patience that felt like gravity. Marla tried to explain. She said she believed she was acting in the community's best interests. She said she never meant harm. There's an old line about intent and outcome, sometimes they don't reconcile. The judge listened. Wait. And then made decisions that were as much about accountability as they were about precedent. She was ordered off the board, fined for forgery, and given community service to make reparations. There were other consequences too, some civil suits, a mandate for HOA transparency, a requirement for third-party oversight on enforcement actions. None of it erased the months of tension. But the law did what law can. It set a boundary and named wrongdoing. After the courtroom, life didn't return to what it had been. It can't when something has pulled a thread through the fabric of a place. Folks had to reckon with how quickly a community could be weaponized. Neighbors who had been indifferent before suddenly asked questions at meetings, demanding records, wanting minutes and receipts. An election followed for the HOA board, and the new council promised openness. Rosa started a community garden association that did things by consensus. Vince, a jokester who'd once suggested we just put a moat around the maple tree, began hosting potlucks that were half neighborhood therapy and half Operation Reconciliation. Small rituals can do a lot of healing, not the loud kind, but the steady, quiet kind that patches fences and hearts. Marla moved away a few months later. She sold her house in a flurry and left without much fanfare. Some say she left because the fines were too heavy. Others say she left because she could no longer stand the daily reminders, the way people stared, the way the grocery store cashiers gave her a polite distance. I don't know her reasons, and I don't want to pretend to. I'll say this, she did not exit like a villain in a movie, slamming a door. She left like a person folding up a life and putting it in a cardboard box. Which is to say, imperfect and human. The town, for its part, kept moving. New caretakers took office and, for the first time in a long while, invited the community to vote on rules rather than accept proclamations. There were smaller victories that mattered to me personally. The private garden sign I'd nailed by hand ended up framed in my study, a ridiculous trophy. But a reminder, things we protect can be symbols of more than themselves. The maple, bless it, stood through another winter. The comings and goings of folks continued, as they always do. The most important outcome, if I had to name one, was that people learned to look at power with a little skepticism. We remembered to ask who benefits when someone demands compliance, and who pays when a person's authority goes unchecked. I want to be clear, this isn't a story to paint one person wholly black. Governance is messy. People are complex. And most disputes never escalate to forged documents and courtrooms. But there are lessons in the way things unravel. When authority is performed rather than earned. When rules are enforced by whim rather than consensus. The fabric of community phrase. When people weaponize the language of protection to cover old scores. The cost isn't just one yard or one sign, it's trust, which takes longer to mend. There's another piece of this I carry with me, and it's less dramatic, but maybe more human. In the months after, I'd sit on the porch sometimes and watch the neighbors. People brought casseroles to Rosa when her husband had surgery. A teenager mowed an elderly man's lawn and refused payment. The maple's leaves turned and fell. and we rake them together with jokes and easy silence. That's the counterweight to the drama, ordinary kindness stitched back together by small acts. In the end, it was the slow, ordinary choices people made to speak up, to document, to ask for oversight, to vote that restored a sense of civic life. Stories like mine spread because they speak to a nervous thing people feel when the small structures we depend on, community boards, neighborhood norms, local institutions, start to creak. They spread because folks want to know what to do if it happens to them. So here's what I learned in the trenches. Keep your paperwork in order. Keep records of conversations. Film if you can. Get friends who will show up for you. And above all, insist on transparency. Not because you want to be suspicious of everyone, but because secrecy breeds the conditions where grievances curdle into control. There was a short, sharp moment after the verdict when Marla, packing her boxes, came back to the neighborhood one late afternoon. She stood at a distance near the corner where the public bench sits and watched. I walked up slowly. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a conversation. She looked at me and said, without theatrics, I thought I was helping. Her voice was small. The words were not an apology. Not really. But they were human. I told her that sometimes the road to harm is paved with intentions. We said nothing more. The air held that awkward stuff that happens when two people who were once neighbors try to close a chapter. The story ends with no tidy bow. I'm not interested in neatness. Life rarely offers it. What I am offering is this. If you see a neighbor's authority becoming louder than their accountability, ask questions. If you live in a place where decisions about shared spaces are made without records, demand records. If someone offers you order as a substitute for respect, be wary. And if you're watching this from somewhere else, chime in the comments, tell us about the small injustices you've seen, the way power plays out where you live. Tell us whether you think the law should be the final word or whether communities should have more tools to resolve these things before they become crimes. So, leave a comment below. Did Marla deserve what she got? Was I right to push back? How would you handle a neighbor who thinks rules are a weapon? Share your stories, your outrage, your compassion, your doubts. Hit like if you believe communities should be governed openly. Share this with someone who lives in an HOA or who's had a run-in with local power. If you want more stories like this, neighborhood dramas, small town politics, the messy ways people try to fix what's broken, subscribe and ring the bell. Tell us where you're watching from. We'll read them out in the next video, and maybe, just maybe, learn how to keep our neighborhoods a little kinder, a little fairer. Thanks for staying with me through this one. It's strange telling a story that once happened to you, seeing the stitches and the rips from the other side, but if there's any comfort, it's that once something ugly gets aired, it's harder for it to be quietly done to someone else. And that, I think, is worth holding on to.